Good morning. Thanks so much for asking me to be with you this morning at this marvelous conclave of readers and writers. As you know, the central theme of this year's festival is World War II in tribute to the 75th anniversary of the Normandy invasion later this spring, but the anniversary isn't the only reason to reflect on the war. Of the 16,112,566 Americans who served in uniform during World War II, fewer than 500,000 are still alive today. They're leaving us at a rate of about 350 a day, including my father, a career infantry officer who died in October at the age of 94. So this is an excellent time to remember all who served, to acknowledge our debt to them, and to recall what they show us about our national fortitude. The novelist John Updike called World War II the 20th century's primal myth. He called it a vast imagining of a primal time when good and evil contended for the planet, a tale of Troy whose angles are infinite, and whose central figures never cease to amaze us with their size, their theatricality, their sweep. The war lasted 2,174 days, and by the end it had become the greatest catastrophe in human history. 60 million dead. That's 27,600 dead every day for 6 years. 1,150 dead an hour. If you were a German boy born between 1915 and 1924, the odds were 1 in 3 that by 1945 you would be dead. 60 million dead in 6 years means a death every 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's World War II. George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, called it a great and terrible epoch, and new words would be required to describe it. Words like genocide and superpower, a neologism that was coined in 1944. Old words assume new usages, words like Holocaust. This war raged across 6 continents on those titanic 3-syllable battlefields that still serve as historical mileposts: Stalingrad, Tarawa, Anzio, Normandy, as well as in places, improbable places, rarely associated with the Second World War, places like the Aleutians, Madagascar, Syria, Darwin, Australia. Well, this is not an undiscovered subject. If you're a writer, how do you take an oft-told tale? Amazon.com lists tens of thousands of World War II titles, and tell it in a way that causes a reader to believe that he or she has never heard it before? Can you take the classical tradition of history, the rhythms of epic, and weave them into a contemporary narrative with a voice that's fundamentally modernist, that is, ironic and skeptical, and which also observes the most rigorous conventions of scholarship? Well, for me, that led to writing 3 volumes, totaling 750,000 words, about the American role in the liberation of Europe, starting where the liberation began, in North Africa, and following our armies into Sicily, southern Italy, and then Western Europe. Those of us toiling in the World War II vineyard have a fine opportunity, because that war is the most documented event in human history in both primary and secondary sources. The U.S. Army alone, by one scholar's computation, the U.S. Army produced 17,120 tons of records from the Second World War. That's equivalent to the payload carried by about 7,000 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. The Americans could have just flown over Berlin and buried the Germans in paper. Boris Pasternak told us that life is always deep in details, and the details live in that vast archive. Now, in sifting through those 17,000 tons and all the rest, it's good to remember that a fact is not a truth until you love it. The words of the Civil War historian and novelist Shelby Foote. We're looking for facts to love, to tease coherence and intimacy from the past, to find those fine brushstrokes that bring the dead to life, because the narrative writer's true calling is to bring back the dead. W.G. Sebald, who was an elegant German writer born in Bavaria in 1944, and before he died in England in a car wreck in December 2001, he wrote, "We have appointments to keep in the past, in what has gone before, and what is, for the most part, extinguished, and we must go there in search of places and people who have some connection with us from the far side of time." Well, toward that end, I'd like us to keep another appointment in the past, almost 75 years ago, on the morning of May 15th, 1944, at St. Paul's School on Hammersmith Road in London. It's a Gothic building of red brick and terracotta, and in that building on that morning, Winston Churchill, George Patton, Omar Bradley, Bernard Montgomery, King George VI, and several dozen other American and British commanders have gathered to review the final secret plan for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. And they met in an auditorium known as the Model Room, sitting on 9 rows of hard wooden benches normally used by schoolboys. The poet John Milton, among other English luminaries, had attended St. Paul's. Even in mid-May, it was as cold as a meat locker in the Model Room because German bombs had broken all 700 windows at St. Paul's. And so many of the generals and admirals were bundled up in their overcoats. And on the floor of the cockpit of the auditorium, there was an enormous plaster of Paris relief map of the Normandy coast where the River Seine spills into the Atlantic at a scale of 6 inches to a mile. And as the plan was reviewed, a British brigadier wearing no-skid socks shuffled across the floor map with a pointer to indicate various locations on what in 3 weeks would become the world's most famous battlefield, like the beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, and towns like Saint-Lô, Cherbourg, and over on the far edge, Paris. The man running that conference is someone you know, Dwight David Eisenhower. In the late spring of 1944, he's 53 years old. He's smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day. Camels. His blood pressure is 176 over 110. That's stage 2 hypertensive. He's a four-star general at the time of Normandy, but he's still in ascent. He's rocketing from lieutenant colonel to 5-star in 42 months. It's an average of 6 months between promotions. President Roosevelt has selected him as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force because he is, as the President says, a natural leader with exceptional political instincts. Eisenhower didn't think that was a slur. He has a knack for getting along with the British, notwithstanding the Anglophobia that infests the senior American ranks. Unlike most of his U.S. Army peers, he likes the British. He's adopted words like petrol and tiffin. It drives George Patton insane. He's also been chosen because he has exceptional organizational gifts. He describes himself as chairman of the board. That's the metaphor he uses. Chairman of the largest martial enterprise in the Western world. Well, the immediate task at hand is to catapult an enormous army across that ugly piece of water known as the English Channel. That alone was among the most complex undertakings in the history of warfare. The channel is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest, but for nearly 1,000 years, invading armies facing a hostile shore across the English Channel had found more grief than glory. One British planner suggested that the only solution is to tow the beaches over already assaulted. The U.S. War Department, in fact, had even pondered tunneling under the seabed. A detailed study was launched. The study came back and said the project was feasible. It would require 1 year and 15,000 miners to excavate 55,000 tons of spoil. Wiser heads questioned the strategic and functional complexities of the plan, such as the inconvenience of having the entire German 7th Army waiting for the first miner's head to pop out of the hole. The study was shelved. Eisenhower and his comrades had so many worries in Operation Overlord that they had their own acronym, PINWE, Problems of the Invasion of Northwest Europe. For example, there was anxiety that German planes would drop rats infected with bubonic plague over London, and authorities in England offered bounties for rat carcasses to test for plague. There was anxiety that German aircraft would disperse what were called radioactive poisons over England, and Geiger counters were stockpiled to test for radioactivity. And of course, there was anxiety that Hitler would initiate chemical warfare with mustard gas, phosgene, and other toxins. The Allies stockpiled 160,000 tons of chemical munitions for retaliatory use in Europe and the Mediterranean. Planners had drafted, with Eisenhower's approval, 2 secret target lists for chemical warfare in Normandy. One list tried to minimize French civilian casualties by hitting German troop concentrations, transportation targets, and bridges. The other list ignored potential French casualties and included dozens of communication centers in northwest France, including many, many post offices. French losses would have been even more enormous than they were from conventional bombs, artillery, and bullets. Well, similar combat efforts, of course, were underway around the world, simultaneously in the Pacific. And even though this morning I'm focused mostly on the United States, let's not suggest that the United States was the preeminent killing power. Soviet forces killed roughly 9 times more German soldiers than Britain and the US combined. The Red Army suffered more combat deaths at Stalingrad alone in late 1942 than the US armed forces sustained in the entire war in all theaters. Of a Soviet population of 190 million, 14% perished. Of the American population of 130 million, about 1/3 of 1% perished. Well, the United States had been among the last of the large powers to be drawn into this conflagration, but very quickly the war encumbered all of America. When the war began in earnest on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, the United States Army, still at peace, was a puny weakling. By one measure, it ranked 17th in the world in size and combat power, right behind that perennial military powerhouse, Romania. It would grow to 8.3 million in 1945, a 44-fold increase. I mentioned that more than 16 million Americans served in uniform, again in a country of 130 million. Virtually every family had someone they loved in harm's way. Virtually every American had an emotional investment in our military. Virtually everyone had skin in the game. You connect the dots to today. Fighting a world war required manpower, lots of manpower. By 1944, 11,000 young men were being drafted into the Army and Navy every day at a rate of 4 million a year. 1 in 3 GIs had only a grade school education. Slightly more than 1 in 10 had attended college for a semester or more. A private, by the way, earned $50 a month, although if he was awarded the Medal of Honor and survived the experience, he got an extra $2 a month in his paycheck. The typical soldier was 5 feet 8 inches tall. He weighed 144 pounds, but the Depression had been very hard on our nation's health. The desperate need for bodies in uniform, especially infantrymen, to go to places like Normandy, led to the drafting of what were known as physically imperfect men. I know that some women consider that phrase redundant. Standards had been lowered to accept defects that once would have kept many out of uniform earlier in the war. For example, draftees at one time had to have at least 12 of their natural 32 teeth. By 1944, how many teeth did you have to be drafted into the United States Army? 0. And that's because the Army and Navy had drafted 1/3 of all the dentists in the United States. Collectively, they extracted 15 million teeth, they filled 68 million more, and they made 2.5 million sets of dentures, all enabling each GI to be able to masticate the Army ration. Sounds like an obscene act, but that was the standard. By 1944, a man could be drafted with 2400 vision if it was correctable to 20/40 in one eye. The armed forces made 2.3 million pairs of eyeglasses during the war. The old joke had come true. The Army didn't examine eyes, it just counted them. In fact, you could be drafted if you were blind in one eye, or if you were completely deaf in one ear, or if you'd lost both external ears, or if you're missing a thumb or 3 fingers on one hand, including your trigger finger. Venereal disease had kept many men out of uniform early in the war, but that restriction also was lifted, and the Army soon was drafting 12,000 men a month with VD, most of them syphilitic. How could they do that? Penicillin. Penicillin. The extraordinary discovery by British scientists of the antibiotic agent in the 1920s was followed by a massive effort by the Americans and the British to take a substance that had been made by the gram and to make it by the kilogram and eventually to make it by the ton. Mental and personality standards for service in the armed forces also had been loosened. In April 1944, the War Department decreed that draftees need have, quote, only a reasonable chance of adjusting to military life. Although psychiatric examiners at draft boards were advised to watch for 24 personality deviations, including silly laughter, sulkiness, resentfulness of discipline, and other traits that would seemingly disqualify every teenager in the United States. Why these extreme measures to fill the ranks? Because of the crying need for soldiers, especially infantrymen, especially riflemen. Even in a country of 130 million, we were running out. The Brits did run out. The war remained brutal and voracious to the very end. In April 1945, the last full month of the war in Europe, almost 11,000 Americans were killed in action in Germany. Nearly as many as had been killed in June 1944, the month of invasion. It was awful to the last gunshot. The war cost U.S. taxpayers $296 billion. That's about $4 trillion in today's currency. To help underwrite a military budget that had increased 8,000%, President Roosevelt increased the number of taxpayers in this country from 4 million to 42 million. Which takes us back to the spring of 1944, 75 years ago, when that conference occurs at St. Paul's School on May 15th. American soldiers by the tens of thousands are pouring into Britain every week. Since January, the number of GIs in Britain had doubled to 1.5 million. It's a country the size of Oregon. Of the U.S. Army's 89 divisions, 20 now could be found in the United Kingdom, with 37 more either en route or earmarked for the European theater. They came through Liverpool, through Swansea, Cardiff, Belfast, but most came through Glasgow and adjacent Greenock. More than 100,000 in April 1944 alone. 15,000 at a time arrived on the two Queens, the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary, ships that could haul an entire division apiece and outrun German U-boats to make the crossing from New York in 5 days. We can see them, can't we? Down the gangplanks they tromp, names checked from a clipboard, each soldier wearing his helmet, his field jacket, and a large celluloid button color-coded by the section of the ship to which he had been confined during the passage. Troops carry 4 blankets apiece to save cargo space. Deluded officers can be seen lugging folding chairs, pillowcases, tennis rackets. A brass band and Highland pipers greet them on the dock. Scottish children raise their arms in V for victory. Combat pilots who have fulfilled their quotas and are waiting to board ship for the return voyage bellow, "Go back before it's too late." Or, "What's your wife's telephone number?" Each arriving unit is listed in a master log called the Iron Book. In another manifest, the forecast of destination shows where every company would bivouac momentarily in Britain. Then they fall in 4 abreast into columns, and they marched from the dock to nearby troop trains to be hauled to 1,200 camps and 133 airfields across the British Isles. GIs called this new land Spam Land. But the prevailing odor came from the burning feces in coal-fired incinerators operated by the U.S. Army School of Hygiene. Despite improving logistics, confusion and error abounded. It's the Army after all. The American juggernaut included millions of tons of materiel, most of it carried across the Atlantic in cargo ships that arrived days, if not months, after the troops on those fast queens. And truck drivers were separated from their trucks, drummers from their drums, chaplains from their chalices. Thousands arrived with indecipherable bills of lading or without shipping addresses other than glue, G-L-U-E. That was the code name for southern England. Or bang, B-A-N-G, code for Northern Ireland. Or ugly, code for unknown. GIs claimed the Army was cutting red tape lengthwise. Now, the loading of invasion vessels in Britain bound for the far shore, that's what they called Normandy, since almost no one knew where they were going. That loading began in earnest on May 4th, 1944, and it intensified as the month wore on. 7,000 kinds of combat necessities had to reach the Norman beaches in the first 4 hours of the invasion, from surgical scissors to bazooka rockets, followed by tens of thousands of tons in the following days. And responsibility for embarkation fell to 3 military bureaucracies with acronyms evocative of the Marx Brothers, MOVCO, Turco, and Embarco. In 22 British ports, stevedores slung pallets and cargo nets into holds and onto decks, loading radios from Pennsylvania, grease from Texas, rifles from Massachusetts. For Overlord, the U.S. Army had accumulated 300,000 vehicles, 1,800 train locomotives, 20,000 rail cars, 300,000 telephone poles, and 7 million tons of gasoline, oil, and lubricants. SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, that's Eisenhower's headquarters, had calculated daily combat consumption for each GI from fuel to bullets to chewing gum at 41.298 pounds per soldier, daily. Again, we can see it, can't we? Day after night after day, war material cascading onto the wharves and the quays, a catalog Homeric in magnitude and variety, radio crystals by the thousands, carrier pigeons by the hundreds, 100 silver stars and 300 purple hearts. Soldiers called the Purple Heart the German Marksmanship Medal. For every American major general to award as warranted. Also, 600,000 doses of penicillin, 50 tons of sulfa, and 800,000 pints of plasma meticulously segregated by black and white donors. A company contracted to deliver 10,000 metal crosses missed its deadline. Instead, Graves registration units would improvise with wooden markers. Cotton mattress covers, used as shrouds for the dead, had been purchased on the basis of one for every 375 man days in France. That formula proved far too optimistic. In July, with supplies of mattress covers dwindling, quartermasters would be forced to ship another 50,000. This is war on the very largest scale, and it was only the beginning. In the European theater alone, the American prodigy of organization, that was Churchill's phrase, would ship 18 million tons of war stuff to Britain and the continent. The kit ranged from 800,000 military vehicles to footwear in sizes 2A to 22 triple E. In 1945, the United States had built 2/3 of all ships afloat worldwide and was making half of all manufactured goods worldwide. World War is a clash of systems. Which system can generate the combat power to prevail, whether it's in the form of the 12,000 Allied airplanes aloft on D-Day, the 10-to-1 advantage in artillery ammunition, often enjoyed by the Allies, the mass production of penicillin and proximity fuses, the ability to design, build, deliver, and detonate an atomic bomb. Which system can produce and educate men? And they were mostly men, which is why the war took as long as it did. The men capable of organizing the shipping, the rail, and truck transportation, the stupendous logistical demands of global war. It's often been argued that in a fair fight, mano a mano, when one American infantry battalion fought a German battalion, or one regiment fought another regiment, that the Germans were usually better. A fair fight? Who's looking for a fair fight? Germany, despite an undeniable genius for tactical and operational warfare, could not muster the wherewithal to cross the English Channel, 21 miles wide, to invade Britain. The U.S. projected power across the Pacific, the Atlantic, into the Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, the seven seas, the infinite skies. Adaptability, versatility, ingenuity, preponderance, raw power, those are the salient characteristics of the U.S. military in World War II. The enemy was crushed by logistical brilliance, firepower, mobility, mechanical aptitude, and an economic juggernaut that produced much, much more of nearly everything than Germany and the other Axis powers could make. Bombers, bombs, fighters, transport planes, mortars, machine guns, trucks. Yet the war absorbed only 1/3 of the American gross domestic product, a smaller proportion than that of any major belligerent. A German prisoner complained, "Warfare like yours is easy." But of course, there was nothing easy about it. Historian Simon Schama once wrote that history deals with the teasing gap separating a lived event from its subsequent narration. And rarely is that gap more exasperating than in writing about military conflict, which is what I've done my entire professional life. Walt Whitman told us the real war will never get in the books. The implication is that war on some level is unknowable, ineffable, too chaotic, too horrible to convey with mere words. That's a subset of the assertion that history is something that never happened, written by a man who wasn't there. The combat journalist Martha Gellhorn, one of the very best, said simply, "War was always worse than I knew how to say." But that's our task, whether you're writing about the grandest of grand strategy or about life in a foxhole for Joe and Willie, to close Schama's gap, to find the words that Gellhorn couldn't, to put the lie to Walt Whitman and ensure that the real war does get in the books. There are different ways to skin this cat. Samuel Hines, a World War II fighter pilot who later taught at Princeton, wrote that historians tell the big stories of campaigns and battles, of the great victories and disastrous defeats, assigning credit and blame, turning war's chaos into order. The men who were there, he says, tell a different story, one that's often quite ahistorical, even anti-historical. Part of my ambition as a writer is to reconcile the two, to square the circle, to embrace the historian's task of confecting order from disorder, but without forfeiting that essence of a soldier's war that is fundamentally experiential, ahistorical, that captures what it smells like. Well, how nearly 3/4 of a century after the shooting stopped in World War II do we assess the consequences? The legacy of the war is profound as the sacrifices that built that legacy. First, of course, Allied victory strangled the sinister ambitions of fascist regimes in Germany, Japan, and Italy. It also brought to an end the British and French empires. It politically fractured both a continent, Europe, and individual countries such as Korea, Vietnam, and Germany. It led to the creation of both the United Nations and NATO. And it yielded a bipolar world, part Soviet, part American, that persisted for a half century. A war that was fundamentally about liberty spawned independence movements and colonial wars that led to the creation of modern India, Pakistan, Ghana, Kenya, Israel, and other states in a fermentation that obviously continues to this day. We Americans emerged from World War II with extraordinary advantages that ensured prosperity for decades. An intact, thriving industrial base, a population relatively unscarred by war, cheap energy, 2/3 of the world's gold supply, great optimism. As the major power in Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, possessing both atomic weapons and a navy and an air force of unequaled might, the United States was ready to exploit what the historian H.P. Wilmot described as the end of the period of European supremacy in the world that had existed for 4 centuries. The war largely dispelled American isolationism, even as it encouraged American exceptionalism, as well as a penchant for military solutions and a self-regard that caused some to label our epic the American century. Remember what John Adams told us? Power always thinks it has a great soul. The war was a potent catalyst for change, for social change across our republic. New technologies, jets, computers, ballistic missiles, mass production of houses, soon spurred vibrant new industries, which in turn encouraged the migration of black workers from south to north, and of all peoples to the emerging West. And here we are. The GI Bill put millions of soldiers into college classrooms, spurring unprecedented social mobility. World War II was perhaps the greatest agent of social change in this country during the 20th century. Our national evolution on core issues of racial and gender equality are very much shaped by the war. Well, what did it cost besides $296 billion? Well, 13 U.S. divisions in Europe suffered at least 100% casualties. 5 more exceeded 200%. That means the divisions are massacred, rebuilt, massacred again. From all theaters, American service casualties in the war included 1,700 left blind, 11,000 with at least partial paralysis of one or more limbs, and 18,000 amputations. Well, aggregate numbers illuminate how unspeakably inhuman the war was. Teasing out the deaths one at a time affirms our humanity. As we consider these big arrows on the map and contemplate the greatest self-inflicted catastrophe in human history, 60 million dead, it's proper to bear in mind the miraculous singularity of death. Each of those deaths was as unique as a fingerprint or a snowflake. Patricia O'Malley was a year old when her father, Major Richard James O'Malley, a battalion commander in the 12th Infantry Regiment, was killed by a sniper in Normandy. After seeing his headstone for the first time in that gorgeous cemetery above Omaha Beach, Patricia wrote, "I cried for the joy of being there and the sadness of my father's death. I cried for all the times I needed a father and never had one. I cried for all the words I'd wanted to say and wanted to hear, but had not. I cried and cried. The Australian war correspondent, Osmer White, who bore witness both in the Pacific and with Patton's Third Army in Europe, later wrote, "The living have the cause of the dead in trust. We, the living, 328 million strong in America today, have the cause of the dead in trust." About 400,000 Americans died during the war, including 291,000 killed in action. After the war ended, there were 353 temporary American military cemeteries scattered around the world. In 1947, the next of kin of all American troops who had been buried overseas, and that was nearly everyone who had died in Europe and the Pacific and whose bodies were recovered, those next of kin filled out Quartermaster Form 345. It was a one-time option offered by the U.S. government whether to have their sons, and they were mostly sons, brought home for reburial, or to have them interred in one of more than a dozen American battle monuments commissioned cemeteries abroad, which were being built to consolidate those many smaller cemeteries. About 40% chose to leave their soldier overseas. 60% opted to bring them home for permanent burial. It was a cost of $564.50 for each disinterment, regardless of where they were ultimately permanently buried. It was something only a rich, victorious nation could afford. Every grave was opened by hand, and the remains of every dead soldier dusted with an embalming compound of formaldehyde, aluminum chloride, wood powder, clay, and plaster of Paris. They were then placed in a metal casket with a satin pillow. Labor strikes in the United States caused a shortage of casket steel, and repatriation was further delayed by a dearth of licensed embalmers. In warehouses at Cherbourg, Cardiff, and elsewhere, the dead accumulated. Finally, the SS Joseph V. Connolly, the first of 21 ghost ships from Europe and the Pacific, sailed from Antwerp with 5,000 soldiers in her hold. On October 27, 1947, the Connolly berthed in New York. Stevedores winched the caskets from the hold, two at a time in specially designed slings, and a great diaspora began as these dead and those that followed traveled mostly by rail across the Republic for burial in their hometowns or in national cemeteries. Among those waiting was Henry A. Wright, a widower who lived on a farm in southwestern Missouri near Springfield. One by one, his dead sons arrived at the local train station. Sergeant Frank H. Wright, killed on Christmas Eve, 1944, in the Battle of the Bulge. Then Private Harold B. Wright, who had died of his wounds in a German prison camp on February 3rd, 1945. And finally, Private Elton E. Wright, killed in Germany on April 25th, just 2 weeks before the war ended. Gray and stooped, the elder Wright watched as the caskets were carried into the rustic bedroom where each of those boys had been born. Neighbors kept vigil overnight, carpeting the floor with roses, and come morning, they bore the brothers to Hilltop Cemetery for burial side by side by side. That's how the dead came home. But what about their belongings? What of the things they carried? Even before the dead came home, these things had been coming back. At a large warehouse on Hardesty Avenue in Kansas City, the U.S. Army Effects Bureau had begun as a modest quartermaster enterprise with a half-dozen employees in February 1942. That expanded to more than 1,000 workers, and by August 1945, they were handling 60,000 shipments a month, each laden with the effects of American dead from 6 continents. Hour after hour, day after day, shipping containers were unloaded from rail freight cars onto a receiving dock and then hoisted by elevator to the depot's 10th floor. And here the containers traveled by assembly line conveyor belt from station to station down to the 7th floor as inspectors pawed through the crates to extract pornography, ammunition, perhaps amorous letters from a girlfriend you didn't want a grieving widow to see. Workers used grinding stones and dentist drills to remove corrosion and blood from helmets and web gear. Laundresses took pains to scrub blood stains out of field jackets and uniform blouses. A detailed inventory was then pinned to each repacked container before it was stacked in a storage bin. And all the while, banks of typists in a huge adjacent room hammered out correspondence to the next of kin, up to 70,000 letters a month, the gist of which was this: Dear sir, dear madam, we have your dead son's stuff. Do you want it back? Where should we send it? Well, over the years, Effects Bureau inspectors found amazing things: tapestries, enemy swords, a German machine gun, an Italian accordion, walrus tusks, a shrunken head, a tobacco sack full of diamonds. Among thousands of diaries also collected in Kansas City was a small notebook that had belonged to Lieutenant Herschel G. Horton, 29 years old, of Aurora, Illinois. Shot in the right leg and hip during a firefight with the Japanese on New Guinea, Horton had dragged himself into a grass shanty, and over the several days that it took for him to die, he had scribbled a final letter in the notebook. It began, "My dear, sweet father, mother, and sister, I lay here in this terrible place, wondering not why God has forsaken me, but why he is making me suffer. The first duty is to remember." Our recent poet laureate, Natasha Trethewey, ends her poem Pilgrimage, which is about a visit to the Civil War battlefield at Vicksburg, with these lines: "In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm." Let's not forget to feel that heavy arm. Thank you so much for asking me to be with you at Rancho Mirage. Thank you.